what properties must this cause possess in order to be the transcendent cause of the physical space-time world? Well, first of all, this cause must itself be uncaused. It must be an uncaused first cause. Why? Because we've seen that an infinite regress of causes is impossible. Remember, the first two philosophical arguments in support of the beginning of the universe were that you cannot have an infinite regress of causes, and therefore the series of causes must terminate in an absolutely first uncaused cause. Secondly, this being must transcend space and time because it created space and time. As the creator of space and time, it must exist beyond space and time because it brought space and time into existence. Now, what does that have for further implications? Well, that means that this being therefore must be a non-physical or immaterial being. This must be a spiritual reality, an immaterial, non-physical being. Why? Well, because physical things exist in space. They have dimensionality. Moreover, physical things exist in time. Physical things are always changing, at least at the atomic level, where there is just constant motion, constant change going on. And so if you get back to an absolutely first spaceless, timeless being, it must be an immaterial, non-physical, changeless reality. Finally, I would argue that it must also be a personal being. Well, let me add one more thing before I talk about its personhood. Obviously, we can also infer that this being would have to be unimaginably powerful, if not omnipotent. Why? Well, because it created all of physical reality from nothing. It created the space-time material universe without any sort of material cause. So it is the efficient cause of the universe. It brings matter and energy, space and time into being, but it does so without any sort of stuff or material because it creates the universe out of nothing. So it would have to be unfathomably powerful, if not omnipotent. And finally, as I say, this is plausibly a personal being. Now, in our discussion of the Leibnizian cosmological argument that was mentioned a moment ago, we already saw one reason why a cause of the universe must plausibly be a personal being. You remember that I said that there are only two kinds of things that we're aware of that can fit the bill of being an immaterial, timeless, changeless reality. And that is either an abstract object, like a mathematical entity, like a number or a set. Numbers are not material physical things. They, if they exist, are immaterial realities. They don't exist in space. The number 7 isn't hiding under a table here in the room or anyplace else in the universe. And they're timeless as well. It's not as though the number 7 endures through time. So abstract objects, mathematical entities, can be immaterial, changeless, spaceless, timeless objects. The other candidate would be a mind, that is to say, an unembodied consciousness or self. The mind is not a material entity, and it needn't be constantly changing as long as its thoughts are changeless and focused on a single intuition of reality. And a mind isn't something that exists necessarily in space. So we could either have an abstract object or an unembodied consciousness as the cause of the universe. And I argued or pointed out that it cannot be an abstract object because abstract objects don't stand in causal relationships. This is part of the very definition of what it means to be an abstract object. The number 7 doesn't have any effects. It has no causal impact upon the universe, nor do any other mathematical entities. So the defining property of abstract objects is their being causally impotent. They don't stand in causal relations. And therefore it follows that the cause of the origin of the universe must be an unembodied mind, a personal, self. That was the reason I gave when we talked about the Leibnizian argument. Let me now share a different reason for the personhood of the first cause that was given by our friend Al-Ghazali, who was, remember, the Muslim philosopher that propounded the Kalam cosmological argument during the Middle Ages. Al-Ghazali argued that the first cause must be a personal being because otherwise it's impossible to explain how you can get a temporal effect with a beginning from a changeless, eternal cause. Here's the problem. If a cause is sufficient to produce its effect, then if the cause is there, the effect should be there. Otherwise, the cause isn't really sufficient for the effect. You'd need something else, and then that would be the cause. So if the cause is sufficient to produce its effect, if the cause is there in all its glory, then the effect must be there as well. The cause cannot exist without its effect once the sufficient conditions for the effect are given. Let me give you an illustration. Suppose that the cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees centigrade. The cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees centigrade. Now, if the temperature were below 0 degrees centigrade from eternity past, then any water that was around would be frozen from eternity. It would be impossible for the water just to begin to freeze a finite time ago. Once the cause is given, the effect must be given as well. So, the problem is, if we have a transcendent, timeless cause that is there, why isn't the effect also permanent as well? Why did the effect only begin a finite time ago if the cause is eternal? How can you have an eternal cause but an effect that only has a beginning a finite time ago? Well, Al-Ghazali's ingenious answer to this dilemma was to say that this is only possible if the cause is a personal agent who is endowed with freedom of the will and who can therefore freely will to create spontaneous new effects that aren't determined by any prior antecedent conditions. So, the cause of the universe can be a personal agent who freely wills to create a universe with a beginning. And this act of creating is a freely willed act that doesn't have any prior determining conditions. So it can be something that's spontaneous and new. For example, to return to our illustration, let's imagine a man who has been sitting from eternity, and he suddenly wills to stand up. And so you would have an effect with a beginning, namely his standing, arise from a cause which is eternal and has always been there. Philosophers call this kind of causation agent causation. The cause is a free agent who, through an exercise of his free will, can bring about a new effect. And so we're brought not simply to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Now, is there any question about that argument for the personhood of the first cause? Joe?
Not so much personhood, but I would like to hear overall what we've talked about, how you'd respond when someone says one of these two things. How would you put this in a very quick, accessible way when somebody says, "Who created God?" That's what that's one of the things we're getting at, I think, by saying it's a nonsensical. But how do you handle that, one? And two, what do you do with somebody who says, "I don't even understand what you mean by a disembodied existence"? How is that even plausible in any?
With respect to the first one, I would say, because an infinite regress is impossible, there has to be a first uncaused cause. If every cause has a prior cause, then you see you've immediately generated an infinite regress. But the whole point of those two philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe was to show that an infinite regress of events or an infinite regress of causes is impossible. So those arguments apply not just to the universe, they would apply to anything, even to God. You cannot have an infinite regress of causes if those arguments are correct. You have to get back to a first uncaused cause. And that would answer the question, what is God's cause? There is no such cause. He's an eternal being. And notice that that doesn't violate the first premise, which says whatever begins to exist has a cause. It doesn't exclude that something that exists eternally can exist without a cause. In fact, that's what philosophers believe about, say, numbers and other abstract entities that exist timelessly. They don't have causes. They're just eternal. That is what the atheist has traditionally believed about the universe, in fact, that it's just eternal and therefore uncaused. But in light of the evidence for the second premise, that's not tenable. So I would say the quick answer is just an infinite regress of causes is impossible. Now, the second part of your question was, right, this is more difficult. I have encountered this again and again on college campuses when I speak, is that people have they don't have any idea what you're talking about when you talk about a consciousness or a mind without a body. We have become so materialized in our culture, so reductionistic, that people equate the mind with, say, the brain, which is an organ that sits in your cranium, rather than understanding the idea of a mind as a self. And of course, that is theism can't even get off the ground if you can't conceive of a person without a body, because that is what God is. So I think we would have to say something about ourselves as immaterial selves who happen to be connected with a body, but point out that on reductive materialism, there are a number of problems. For example, the brain is not joyful or happy or cheery. Those are properties, those are mental states, and would not characterize a physical organ. Those are mental properties that could only characterize an immaterial self. You could also point out that the phenomenon of intentionality, which is the idea of having thoughts about something. I think about lunch, or I think about my house or my pet. Physical objects don't have intentionality. They don't have aboutness. These are, again, properties of mental states, which can't be reduced to the brain. And finally, freedom of the will is also something that we experience deeply ourselves. And yet that is not something that would characterize a physical entity that is simply the product of antecedent determining causes. To have freedom of the will, you need an immaterial self that has the ability to influence brain states. Otherwise, if the causation is all one way, if it's just from brain to mind, then everything you think is determined. But if you think you can actually cause things to happen in your body, like willing to lift your arm, or willing to write with this marker, or willing to take a step, then you've got causation that goes from the mind to the brain. It's a two-way street. It's not just brain to mind. You've got mind to brain causation. And that implies this non-reductive view of the self. It implies that you're an immaterial entity that is conjoined or correlated with a physical body and a brain, but not reducible to it. And therefore, I think in our deepest introspective knowledge of ourselves, we already have acquaintance with the idea of an immaterial self. And many of us believe that when our physical bodies die, that immaterial self continues to exist. This has certainly been the majority view among the peoples of the world. This is hardly an obscure or recondite view. So I think the atheist here would need to give us some kind of, again, argument as to why that's impossible to have an immaterial self without a body. But I think you're certainly right, Joe, in saying that this is an obstacle that increasingly we as Christians are going to confront in our culture because of this reductive materialist view of human persons that seems to be so prominent. Yes, Steve.
Dr. Craig, can you also conclude that there's only one mind? Because if there was more than one, you'd have to reintroduce time.
Yes. This argument doesn't prove that there's only one self or one mind that has caused the universe. Here I would simply appeal to Occam's razor, which says don't multiply causes beyond necessity. Occam's razor says that you're only justified in inferring those causes which are required to explain the effect. And what is required to explain the effect here, the origin of the universe, is an immaterial, transcendent, personal creator. And it would be unjustified to infer that there's more than one of these. So Occam's razor will simply shave away these additional entities. So on the basis of this argument alone, it doesn't prove monotheism, but on the other hand, I think Occam's razor would say that you would be unjustified in inferring anything more than one personal creator of the universe.
I think this is the first time I've ever had a comment instead of a question, but it actually might have come from one of your books. But I found that the absolute easiest way to explain or prove the personal nature was like if you're at home in the kitchen and you walk into the room and the water's boiling and you ask your mom, why is the water boiling? And she can give you two explanations. One, either she can say, well, the electrons are moving really fast. It's creating heat, which is actually being transferred into the pot, which is being transferred into the water and creating bubbles and that. Or she can say, I wanted to make you dinner. And since there is no science before creation, then there is no scientific explanation, which leaves only a personal explanation.
Very good. This is an argument that Richard Swinburne, the Oxford philosopher, has developed for the personhood of the cause of the universe. Swinburne says, as been explained, that there are two kinds of explanation. There are scientific explanations, which are given in terms of laws of nature and initial conditions. On the other hand, there are personal explanations, which are given in terms of an agent and his or her volitions, what he or she wills to do. Both of these are legitimate sorts of explanations, and in some contexts, it would be totally inappropriate to give one rather than the other. When you walk into the kitchen and see the kettle boiling and say, why is the kettle boiling? Clearly, you're looking for a personal explanation, not a scientific one. It doesn't mean a scientific one couldn't be given, but the personal one is what's being asked for here. Now, what Swinburne points out is that a first state of the universe, the first state of the existence of the universe, its beginning, can't have a scientific explanation because there aren't any laws of nature or initial conditions from which that first state could be explained, because it is the first state. There is no antecedent state. So for the first state of the universe, a scientific explanation is ruled out. It has to be a personal explanation. And that will get you, as Ben explained, to a personal creator of the universe. So those, I think we got three good arguments for the personhood of the creator. One would be the argument from the dilemma, either an abstract object or a mind, not an abstract object, therefore a mind. The second would be Al-Ghazali's argument that it is only by a personal agent that you can explain how an effect with a beginning could arise from an eternal cause. And the third argument would be the Swinburne-Ben Jones argument that you cannot have a scientific explanation of the first state of the universe, and therefore it has to be a personal explanation. Yes, Bob.
Yes, Bill, I believe in your book you argue against an infinite regress of events as well as causes,
yes.
With the idea being that would constitute an actual infinity,
yes.
which we know can't exist. Well, if we consider God's thoughts as events, which I don't believe is much of a stretch, couldn't you use that argument to say that God himself would have to have a beginning?
No, what you would have to argue is that God's successive train of thoughts would have to have a beginning. And that is, in fact, what I would affirm. I would say that God existing alone, without the creation, without the universe, isn't in a stream of consciousness, of thinking one thought after another. He is in a changeless state in which he has an intuition of all truth without change. And this is one of the classical attributes of God, is God's changelessness or his immutability, which means that God doesn't have a mental life which is characterized by succession. And I think that you're quite right, that this argument would apply to God as well. And it will give you a concept of God's mental life that is right in line with classical Christian theology about God's immutability. One more question, and then we'll close. Yes, Sid.
I can believe that we have an uncaused creator. But where I'm having a little trouble here is that the creator definitely, seems to me, he had a cause when he created the universe.
Say that again now.
Well, we talk about this cause is uncaused.
Yes.
That's really where I'm having the problem grasping that. If the creator, I can understand the creator being uncaused.
All right.
But did he not have a cause in mind when he created the universe?
Okay, this is a very good question that requires us to draw a distinction, I think, between a cause and a reason. We want to distinguish between a cause and a reason. And what I'm saying is that there is no cause that made God create the universe. He freely brought the universe into being. There's nothing that caused God to create the universe. But that doesn't mean he didn't have a reason for creating the universe. When we use reason here, we're thinking of something like motivation or goal or something of that sort. And certainly God had a reason for creating the universe, namely to create finite persons in his image and invite them into the intra-Trinitarian fellowship of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as adopted sons and daughters of God. So he bestows on creatures this incredible gift of knowledge of himself, the supreme good, the source of infinite goodness and love. So certainly God had a reason for creating the universe, but I don't think he had a cause that made him create the universe, because God is a free being and he didn't have to create the universe. It was a free act of his will. All right. Well, with that then we'll close the Kalam cosmological argument. This argument I think is very powerful because it gives us then grounds for believing in the existence of a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which is the core concept of what theists mean by God. Next time, then, we'll move on to the argument for the design of the universe and a cosmic designer.
The copyright for the content of this recording is held by Dr. William Lane Craig. For more, go to reasonablefaith.org.